We're here on Capitol Hill today for the 112th Congress final hearing on high-speed rail at the Transportation Infrastructure Committee under Chairman Mica. The hearing today will discuss bringing private investment into high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor. Let's join the hearing.
Good morning. Welcome to this hearing of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and welcome everyone this morning. Pleased you could join us. The title of today's hearing is the Northeast Corridor Future and Options for High-Speed Rail Development and Opportunities for Private Sector Participation. The order of business will be opening statements by members, and we have another member who's joined us. We'll have an individual panel made up of Ms. Maloney. Then we'll go to our next panel of witnesses and question them and proceed with the hearing in that order. Let me make just a couple of custodial announcements. Apologize the other day we tried to get the official hearing, official committee room photo of the committee, and notice went askew, but we will reschedule that. And if votes are canceled on Monday, which I don't know if they've made that announcement, but if they do, we'll probably shift the official photo to Wednesday morning. Folks may not come back till Tuesday, and probably about 10:15 because there's a Republican conference and Democrat caucus usually from 9 to 10 here, and we want to make certain everyone's notified. In addition, I would like to the members in the official photo, if we could have staff from both sides of the aisle to join us for one of the photos so that we can include them in one of the photographs that morning. It shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes to get that done, but we would like to invite everyone and put everyone on notice. And we'll try to get triple notification out to everyone for that. This morning's hearing is a continuation and be actually probably the last full hearing of the committee, and pleased to have chaired the committee during the past 20-some months and focus on our transportation needs and requirements. The very first hearing that I held as chairman was, I believe, January 27th. It was a field hearing in Grand Central Station. And it focused on the same issue, the development of the Northeast Corridor and high-speed rail. This hearing is also part of a series of hearings to examine some of the operations of our primary transportation long-distance and high-speed carrier, which is Amtrak. And as you know, I've been one of the most vocal critics of Amtrak and its operations, but I'm also, I think I consider myself one of the strongest proponents of high-speed rail, intercity passenger service, commuter and mass transit in the Congress and in the United States. But what we want are projects that make sense for the taxpayers, but we want are projects that operate where we have the greatest need and the lowest subsidization by the federal government for those activities. But today we'll focus almost entirely on the Northeast Corridor where we started, and let me make a few comments about that. First, I have to say that the history of Amtrak and attempting to provide high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor has been sort of a horrible history, and maybe I can highlight some of the problems we've had. And I don't want to focus just on the problems we've had, but you have to learn by your experience. First, the original intent to develop high-speed rail in the corridor we came up with the Acela project. We've had regional service in the Northeast Corridor in the area from Washington, D.C. to New York and to Boston. And let me say, I think it's absolutely critical that we develop that corridor. It's in the not only the regional interest, but in the national interest. We have the highest concentration of population. We have the most sophisticated delivery system and interconnection. We have light rail, subway, we have metro, we have connectors all up and down the corridor so that high-speed rail is not something that will run by itself. As opposed to last week, we heard about the major administration effort to produce high speed. They're doing it between, I think, Bakersfield and Fresno in California, where there are very few people. Their intention is long-term to connect it into population centers in San Francisco and Los Angeles, but it'll be a long time before that is accomplished. Right now, we do have the connectivity that we need. We have the population. And then we also have the only corridor, this 430-some-mile corridor, is almost entirely owned by Amtrak, the American people, and the taxpayers. That's opposed to the rest of Amtrak service, 20,000 miles of service, long distance, and some intercity service, on which Amtrak runs on private freight rail that's maintained and paid for on a lease basis to the private sector. We in fact, again, own this corridor. And we've also highlighted before, actually I took the chairmanship in October of 2010, report, and the summary of the title is "The Federal Government Must Stop Sitting on Its Assets." The first part deals with GSA, and we've taken on GSA and some of the idle buildings that have sat vacant. That, in fact, met with Mr. Tangolini a few minutes ago to continue that effort to get empty buildings filled. If you read through this report, and it is online, it also talks about the Northeast Corridor, which is one of the most valuable assets, transportation infrastructure assets in the entire world, not just the United States. And it is an asset that we're sitting on that the taxpayers own. It probably never will be developed to its fullest potential by Amtrak. The federal government just has trouble operating a two-car train set, let alone developing a corridor with incredible real estate development potential and as a transportation and communications corridor. But this outlines, again, part of our goal was to take this asset, turn it into a valuable return and a transportation system for the American people. So we did our first hearing January 27, 2011. We had heard at that time, I think the plans by the administration were to spend, and they had developed these plans in September 2010. They were going to develop the Northeast Corridor. It was going to cost $117 billion and take 30 years. The most recent projection that we have, and part of this hearing is to focus on where we stand with that effort to move forward in making this truly high speed. But they're looking at $151 billion and also 30 years. My premise is that it can be done in a third of the time and probably at much less cost. You'll hear Amtrak come forward in a few minutes, and they're going to tell you how their ridership is over the top. They're at 31 million, something like that. We probably have that many passengers in the D.C. metro system in 1 month. But then they'll also tell you the success in the Northeast Corridor. The figures we have from their reports are the Northeast Corridor had 12.9 million riders in 2000. In 2012, recently released figures, and this is on the fiscal year, not the annual year, they had 11.4 million riders. Most of the increase has been in the state partnerships and other partnerships rather than, again, totally in the Northeast Corridor. The Northeast Corridor, and I think their projections are right. I've looked at their study, predict that you could have as many as 40 million riders in the Northeast Corridor, which is a number of times more than we currently have. Unfortunately, the train runs about 83, 84 miles an hour per, that's miles per hour average. They will tell you that they can get up to speeds of 150 or 160 miles per hour. That is not high speed the way it's calculated. It's average miles per hour. The minimum actually under U.S. order, if we have a standard, is 110. Almost every high-speed train in the world is running today at 130, some 150 miles per hour average. And here we're in the dark ages as far as 83 miles. You'll probably hear from Ms. Maloney in a few minutes. The segment from New York to Boston is, I think, around 68 miles per hour average. Pitiful. Again, I started to talk about some of the horrible history highlights of Amtrak's attempts to get into high-speed rail. They did acquire a train some years ago, called it the Acela. The acquisition was a total disaster. There were extended, very expensive lawsuits that went on and on. They acquired a European design, and they acquired a European sleek model that was allowed to tilt because you can get faster speed and you have curves and other things that could enhance the speed. Unfortunately, Amtrak, in the way it handled first the acquisition and then the redesign of the equipment, redesigned the vehicles so they were wider. And they miscalculated because when the train got to higher speeds and it tilted, the wider trains would hit. So to compensate for that, they had to put metal shims into the expensive high-speed rail tilt trains that they bought so that they wouldn't tilt. So that was the beginning of the fiascos. But unfortunately, the failure went on and on. For about a half a year, we closed down most of the Acela operations because they didn't have brake parts. They bought equipment for which they didn't have parts. Again, another sad chapter in both their acquisition and operation and ability to operate and maintain any semblance of inner-city passenger service in that corridor. They will tell you that they do make money, but they don't tell you that most of the capital that we provided, both from the Congress and also the subsidization and the stimulus money, has been spent for capital improvements. I defy anyone who's in business to not include some capital cost in your expenses. So that's part of the problem that we face. I want to say we've got some friends from labor here. First of all, I kind of like leaving my position because of chairman, because I've had so many items to say grace over. And I might add at this juncture, too, I'm very pleased with the progress of this committee in 20 months, 20-some months. We've passed almost every major piece of legislation. We passed a transportation bill that they said we couldn't pass. They passed an FAA bill that had 17 extensions. And last night, we passed a pipeline safety bill. Last night, the Senate passed our Coast Guard bill, and it's on its way to the President of the United States for a signature. And we're negotiating reauthorization provisions for FEMA, which would be the only remaining item that hasn't been addressed. So I think it's a record that speaks for itself. We have made some progress. I started to say about labor. I want to tell our labor folks that I remain committed to making certain that the benefits, the wages, the retirement opportunities remain constant for our Amtrak employees. However, their future is dim if you continue down this path, which some of the labor leaders have led our workers on. We've gone, since I came to Congress, from 29,000 Amtrak employees to 19,000. And if you continue down this path, I don't think that's hopeful. If we actually expand the service in the Northeast Corridor and create true high-speed service, I believe it will be replicated where it makes sense across the United States, and opportunities for workers will expand, not contract. Finally, we have made some progress. We've finally got a designation of the Northeast Corridor by the administration as a high-speed corridor, which wasn't done before. We are now undertaking an environmental review. I'm hoping we can assist them, and we'll hear more of the progress of that in speeding this up. We have provisions that were written under PREA, which I actually helped author. And we need to look at improvements in PREA so that we can move forward on an expedited basis, not only with environmental review, but also with construction, operation, future maintenance of these systems. Finally, pleased with the progress of the Northeast Commission. We'll hear from them today. They're moving in the direction that we set by law, but we want to make certain that we move that timetable forward. The Northeast Corridor is vital, not only because of the mention I made of congestion and the interconnectivity, and that we own the corridor, but also the entire country benefits, because 70+% of our chronically delayed airplane flights emanate from the Northeast Corridor, and everyone will benefit by having true high-speed rail in that corridor. So with those extended comments, and I had to take a little bit of extra time being sure that discretion, that's the bad news. Is the good news is you won't have to put up with that again after this hearing. So let me yield to my delightful and trusted and wonderful, pleasant colleague, and the former chair of the Rail Subcommittee, current ranking member, Ms. Brown, my colleague from Florida.
Thank you. First of all, I want to sincerely thank the chairman for his service as chairman of this committee. I do know that you really have a deep love for transportation, and I would ask that the committee and the people in the audience give you a hand for your service. Thank you. And I want to welcome my classmate. We all came together, Ms. Maloney and Mr. Mica. We're all in the great class of '92. I'm happy that we're having this hearing today, but I really kind of wish it was on Water Resource Development Act, which is something that we have not dealt with. I held a meeting yesterday between the Port of Jacksonville and the Corps of Engineers to try to find a way to fix a navigation hazards at the port. But because this committee has failed to even work on developing a water bill, those ships will continue to be in danger, and the economic development of the port will continue to suffer. Again, I am pleased that the current leadership of this House wasn't in charge when the Northeast Corridor was originally developed, because it would not exist today. Just like high-speed rail in California, the Republicans, like the vision on transportation, is going to impact our nation's economic development, and it is a very negative way for a very long time. Let's be clear. The Republicans is no friend to rail. They have plenty to say about what others are doing wrong, but they never put their money where their mouth is. The only goal during 8 years of the Bush administration was to sole focus on destroying Amtrak, which is clearly still the focus of this Republican House of Representatives Transportation Committee. There is no plan to improve our nation's rail system, no investment made in the new system or even our current system. In fact, the Bush administration and the Republicans in Congress spend most of their money rebuilding transportation infrastructure in Iraq and Afghanistan, more money they spent there than right here in the United States of America. So after 8 years of lip service from the Republicans, President Barack Obama committed real money to improve our nation's rail system, including the development of high-speed rail, and lo and behold, the same members who didn't dedicate 1 cent to high-speed rail when they was in charge are complaining that the money wasn't spent the way they wanted it to be spent. Mr. Mica, unhealthy obsession with privatizing the Northeast Corridor has been limited support and even violates the U.S. Constitution. The chairman privatizing language in the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act of 2008 garnished no private sector proposal for the Northeast Corridor, and his Rail Competition Act introduced last year was determined by the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service to be a violation of the appointment clause of the Constitution that would raise costs for states and commuter authorities and eliminate long-distance service. I fully agree that we need true high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor, but we need to have a serious conversation about how this is to happen, and those hearings focus solely on privatizing with the goal of making the administration look bad and gotcha politics need to stop. I want to welcome today's panelists and thank them for joining us, and I look forward to their testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentlelady, and also thank her for her comments. Agreed with the first part of her statement rather than the latter part.
But, that's right.
But we do, you can tell we do have a good rapport. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Sears? Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Sears. You're recognized. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to say thank you for all the hard work that you have in the last 20 months. We may not agree on a lot of things, but certainly transportation is important to you. I also want to commend you on your portrait. You look like you're 30 years old, and that looks great.
Thank you.
And, you know, someone who rides the rail just about every weekend, you know, this corridor is really important to me, because I am a rider, and I see how it is packed all the time. Do I wish we had a super speed? Absolutely. You know, it takes me about 2.5 hours to get from Newark to Washington, D.C. And could we make it a lot better? You know, absolutely. This region, the northern region, is a very congested area. And if you really want to see it, drive up once in a while, like I do, and get on the New Jersey Turnpike on exit 1. And you see how you want to get back on the train, because it is so congested and so much work. I would hope that in the future we can really seriously think about high-speed rail. This is a region of the country that generates jobs, and more important than anything else, it has the ridership to sustain such an investment. So I look forward to working in this committee towards that, and I want to thank the people at Amtrak who week in and week out do a great job in trying to accommodate the people that ride. Could it be better? Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Other members seek recognition. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Brown. The Northeast Corridor is the transportation artery through some of the most populous metropolitan areas and regions in the entire U.S. And it is essential for commerce and that we are able to move goods and people up and down the eastern seaboard efficiently.
Stay right here.
But with increased congestion, both on our roads and in our skies, our current system is reaching its capacity. Not only are we currently reaching that capacity, but it's estimated that an additional 15 million residents will live in the already congested Northeast Corridor by 2050, a 30% increase. It is for this reason that our continued investment in passenger rail is so essential. The recent Thanksgiving holiday set a record for Amtrak ridership, with 737,537 passengers. The record ridership brought in $56.1 million to Amtrak, an 8.4% increase over 2011. The Northeast Corridor is profitable and serves as a model for what we can accomplish with small investments in infrastructure in other parts of the country. What is unclear to me is why there's been a constant drumbeat to privatize Amtrak and to starve it of its much-needed funding. As everyone on this committee knows, funding for infrastructure, whether it is for rail, transit, or surface transportation, has always come from the public sector. And only after we have made significant investments does it become attractive to the private sector. No one on this committee would suggest that it would be a good idea to privatize our roads and would suggest that it would be a good idea to privatize our bridges. Yet we come back to this issue again and again with rail. I would suggest that a more worthwhile endeavor for this committee would be to check the partisan politics at the door and examine how we can improve and expand all modes of transportation that the American people depend upon. I thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for calling this hearing, and look forward to the witness's testimony. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to, I could not let this moment go by without thanking you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership. You and I have served on this committee for many years, and we've also served on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and I know that you have worked very hard to bring about a lot of change in our nation and to our rail system. We may not always agree on those changes and how they should be made, but I have a tremendous amount of respect for you, and certainly I want to thank you for your service. And I also want to thank Ms. Brown, Ranking Member Brown, for her leadership and her staunch advocacy for the rail system and particularly Amtrak. Mr. Chairman, I could not let this moment go by again without at least expressing some disagreement with you with regard to unions. Unions are very, very important. It was unions that allowed my parents to raise 7 children and as former sharecroppers with only a second-grade education in one generation to send their kids to college and allow me to be a member of the Congress of the United States of America. It was unions. And I will fight until I die for the strength of unions because they do play a very significant role. Now, as a representative from Maryland, I know how critical the Northeast Corridor is to ensuring mobility from the Mid-Atlantic to New York and Boston. The corridor is also critical to local mobility and hosts many commuter rail lines, including Maryland's MARC system. Every year, 11 million passengers, our constituents, ride Amtrak in the Northeast Corridor. Ridership that, as Secretary LaHood told this committee last week, is only expected to increase with population growth. Isn't that wonderful? While the creation of the Acela service moved us in the direction of high-speed rail, the Acela service simply isn't as fast as we need. We need modern high-speed rail service, and we particularly need it in the Northeast Corridor. I remind us that this is America. This is the United States of America, the greatest country in the world. We should have the very best service in the world. For that reason, I strongly support the vision for high-speed rail set forth by President Obama, as well as the Department of Transportation's decision to designate the Northeast Corridor as a high-speed corridor. At last week's hearing, I was pleased to hear Secretary LaHood discuss some of the progress that is being made in the efforts to modernize this essential infrastructure. I also applaud Amtrak's moves to develop a business plan that will attract appropriate private investment. That said, I strongly oppose any proposal that would turn responsibility for the development of the corridor over to the Northeast states. Development of the corridor will cost billions of dollars, and it's simply unrealistic to think that the private sector will make that investment alone. And I know that my home state of Maryland, like the other states in the corridor, does not have the resources available to develop it. I know that last week we heard from Edward Hamburger, President and CEO of the Association of American Railroads, who argued that there should only be one passenger rail operator, and that operator should be Amtrak. He stated that Amtrak is a leader in safety, security, operations, labor issues, and is a great partner for the private freight sector. Of course, significant infrastructure improvements are needed all along the corridor to modernize it and enable it to meet the growing demand. In Maryland, for example, the B&P Tunnel, which carries every train traveling into Washington, D.C. from points north of the city, must be replaced. The tunnel was opened in 1873, and its antiquated design limits train speeds to 30 miles an hour. We can do better. We must do better. This is the United States of America. In an effort to begin the long process that will be required to eliminate this bottleneck, I supported inclusion of a provision in the 2008 rail safety legislation that directed the Federal Railroad Administration to work with Amtrak, the Surface Transportation Board, the City of Baltimore, the State of Maryland, and rail operators to select and improve a new rail tunnel alignment through Baltimore that will permit an increase in train speed and service reliability. This provision requires environmental reviews for the new alignment to be completed by September 30th, 2013. The project subsequently received from the Recovery and Reinvestment Act $60 million in funding authorized in the Rail Safety Bill to support the studies necessary to enable a new alignment to be selected. And so, Mr. Chairman, we move forward. And I know that we move forward with your blessings. Again, I want to thank you for your tremendous leadership. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Other members seek recognition? No other members seek recognition? Then we'll welcome our colleague, the Honorable Carolyn Maloney, who represents New York, and we'll recognize her for a statement. Thank you, and you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Chairman Mica, and my good friend and colleague, Corrine Brown, and the members of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure for inviting me to speak at this hearing. I am truly honored to be here at the Chairman's final hearing, and I want to thank him for his focus on bringing high-speed rail to the Northeast Corridor and for his support of the 2nd Avenue subway. I appreciate that last year's field hearing was held in New York. To begin with, and I would just like to say, Mr. Chairman, I know this is your last hearing, and I hope you will keep your focus on the Northeast Corridor, and I would like to challenge you to start a bipartisan caucus of Republicans and Democrats to work together on the Northeast Corridor, all the affected states and communities, because we know how hard it is to push proposals through Congress and to make them happen. I truly agree with your analysis that we could cut this price down a third and that we could cut the time down a third and build it in 10 years if those of us who care about it decided to focus on it, and if Corrine would help us out, who has always been such a great advocate on high-speed rail. So I hope you'll think about that, and I appreciate what you have done already. I just want to begin my comments by thanking the men and women of Amtrak, Metropolitan Transit Authority, the Long Island Railroad, and all transportation workers who have worked around the clock to restore the services in New York after the terrible flooding from Hurricane Sandy. It was the worst in the 108 years of our transportation system, but because of their hard work, our trains are up and running again. In tough economic times, it is critically important to make needed investments that will modernize our aging infrastructure, advance our mass transit systems, and strengthen our communities and workforce. High-speed rail and improved mass transit networks can play a central role in helping America keep its competitive edge in a global economy. By comparison to rail systems in the rest of the world, our trains crawl along. As the Chairman has pointed out, even our most ambitious plans aren't even anywhere near truly high-speed rail. Acela averages only 83 miles per hour along the Northeast Corridor, while some European and Asian trains race by at more than 180 miles per hour. The connection between two major business districts in our country, between Boston and New York, it inches along at 68 miles per hour. And imagine if we could cut that and speed that up, how those business districts would boom and expand with a more efficient and productive economy. Where once American ingenuity brought rail service through the wilderness, from coast to coast, in recent decades, the U.S. has systematically failed to invest in the modern rail system. I thank President Obama for making high-speed rail a priority. Instead of developing energy-efficient mass transit, we have allowed our rail system to deteriorate. We're not just lagging, we're not even trying to innovate. That's just not the American way. As a resident of New York City, I fully understand the tremendous value of access to high-speed passenger rail service along the Northeast Corridor. It is the busiest rail line in the United States, and it is the only Amtrak segment that runs an operating surplus. It is making a profit. Of all the places in our nation, high-speed rail makes most sense along the Northeast Corridor, which features the most congested roads and airspaces, the densest population, and the most interconnected cities. And it has the ridership to make a profit for the investment in this rail system. From Washington to Boston, the Amtrak stations are located right in the city centers, making them more accessible to business travelers than the airports. The Northeast region also has the densest population in the country. Fully 20% of the nation's entire population lives in just this 2% of our land area in our great country. 70% of all chronically delayed flights originate in the New York area airspace, causing delays across our country. And 60% of the Northeast region's road miles are considered heavily congested. Last year, when Florida's governor rejected high-speed rail funding for his state, I urged our president, our mayor, our governor, the New York delegation, and other delegations to redirect some of the money to New York. I was pleased he responded with the help of the chairman and the New York delegation, our governor, our mayor, by directing $295 million of these funds to a project that will improve what's called the Harold Interlocking, a century-old intersection of 14 train tracks where hundreds of trains travel east and west of New York, are sorted out each day, and is very confusing and a very delaying area. Located in my congressional district, this project helps eliminate a bottleneck that has plagued train travelers for years. Investing in these improvements will help relieve delays and pave the way for high-speed rail from New York to Boston. I consider it the first link in this important, vital rail system. It will create over 9,000 jobs and will boost economic activity in our region by over $500,000. While I commend this investment, Amtrak estimates that at this rate, it will take until the year 2014 before the U.S. has high-speed rail. The need for high-speed rail is so pressing today, we cannot afford to wait another generation. We used to lead the world in rail. We are now trailing far behind. There is general agreement that public and private partnerships should be included in a larger federal planning strategy for the Northeast Corridor. Amtrak's long-term plan provides a template for joint ventures that is worth discussing. New York's governor has met with the New York delegation and asked us to include public-private partnerships. And the MTA, which is strapped for cash, as is our state, and I join my colleague, Mr. Cummings. The states cannot afford this. We don't have the money. So the MTA is open to partnerships as long as unions and worker rights are protected and all the rights that have put in place for the protection of workers, the environments, the pension, and other rights. Investing now in world-class high-speed rail would pack a double punch. It would create high-paying jobs and spur economic development throughout the program. We are long overdue for high-speed rail, and it's time to put this country on the right track. I thank the committee for drawing attention to the importance of high-speed rail, and I look forward to the day when high-speed passenger rail is operating in the Northeast Corridor. In closing, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, if we really support high-speed rail, then projects that we fund have to be successful, and they have to be profitable. Right now, the Northeast Corridor is profitable. It is the only corridor that is profitable in the whole nation. So investing in high-speed rail now would boom. My colleague, Congressman Capuano from Boston, we both travel between New York and Boston, usually a 3.5, 4-hour ride. If we could cut that down to an hour and a half or 2 hours, it would be a boon to economic development in two important business and employment districts in our great country. So I applaud your attention to it, and I want to be on your team in helping to implement and support transportation in any way. It's vital to our country, but particularly high-speed rail. How did the great country, the great United States, fall so far behind the rest of the world? How did the most prosperous country, the most innovative country, fall so far behind the rest of the world? You can be in Paris and in an hour and a half be in London, riding their high-speed rail. You can move across China throughout their many provinces on high-speed rail. We do not have it. We aren't even close to it in the great United States of America. And if it is going to happen in America, it has to happen with the leadership of you, the leadership of this committee. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for all the work that you do for transportation across our great country. And I am welcome to any questions.
Well, thank you. I don't think we'll question you, but I will ask unanimous consent that Ms. Maloney be extended the courtesy to sit on our panel, and after other members have been heard or questioned, you'll have the opportunity to participate if you like. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you so much for your
Thank you, Mr.
testimony.
Chairman.
I'll just say two things. One, you asked about the caucus. Unfortunately, I don't make many pledges. Didn't even pledge to term limits, but that's another story. But I did make a pledge when I first ran not to join caucuses, and I actually spent part of my early part of my career dismantling select committees and things that had grown into huge bureaucracies, filled a whole building next to us where the parking lot is. Now we took it down. So I can't do that, but I can tell you I'll be focused on two projects, and one will be high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor, whatever it takes, and work with you and others in that positive regard. So thank you, and we'll let you go, and we're going to have a vote, so we'll turn to our witnesses and try to get them up.
May I thank the gentleman and chairman for allowing me to join the committee. I am in another committee
but
that I have a responsibility to be asking questions and participating. So thank you for that honor. If my other committee meeting finishes, I will come back and join you. Thank you so much.
We welcome you, and thank you again for coming to the committee and testifying.
I did have one question.
Okay, real quick.
I just had one question, because, you know, I'm 100% in support of high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor. And one of the problems, or one of the challenges, is not just high speed, is making sure the train is there at a certain time. You know, making sure it's reliable and it's going to be there every day at 10 o'clock or whatever time. But the time from I think Boston to Washington is about 8 hours, which is ludicrous. And as you said, that corridor between New York, Boston, and Washington is key. However, part of the problem is that you have so many local communities. And even in your area, when we had the hearing in New York, it's not just Amtrak, it's several agencies, several communities this involved. And so it's not just that you as big government can come in and say that we're going to do it this way. It's pulling all of those communities together. And what is your, and you don't have to do it now, but it's just that we can't come in as the federal government and say we're going to do it this way. These communities are already built up.
Mm-hmm. I thank Corrine for your question. When the high-speed money was returned, and we discussed it because you were distressed that Florida was sending it back, and I appreciate that, you know, and you were pushing to have it in Florida, but your governor made another decision, so we reacted to that. But I went to MTA, which is the transportation hub and director in our region, and first proposed that they go after getting the high-speed rail between New York and Washington. And they said that would be so difficult because of what you just said. It is extremely built up along the corridor, very, very built up. And they couldn't see how they could build that quickly because of the communities that were blocking it and the fact that we did not own the rail. They said they own the rail. The federal government and the MTA owns the rail lines between New York and Boston, and that would be much easier. And they said, shift your focus to New York and Boston, and with the governor's support and the mayor's support, that's what we did. Now, that's why we need, exactly what you're saying, why we need a task force or a meeting, I don't care what you call it, of members of Congress that are affected by that rail line to get together and make it happen, to get the communities behind it. And, you know, it goes through many states, and so it would have to be a collective state-led members of Congress from those states working to help make it happen. But according to the MTA, they own a lot of the lines, meaning the MTA owns it and the federal government owns it, and it's not as dense. It goes through the countryside, the rail now. It's not going through cities as much. But they said going between New York and Washington, you know I'd love to cut that time down since I'm on that train every week.
That's right, that's right.
But they said Boston and New York made sense, would be more economical, there would be less hindrance of already built up neighborhoods, and that it could be done quicker and cheaper. And I think it's important for those of us who support high-speed rail to have a success. We want it to make money. We want to show America that this is something we should invest in and that it's going to pay dividends back, and that we should be building it in every state, and we should be building it clear across America. But there are certain areas in New York where it's not going to make money because the ridership isn't great. The ridership between New York and Boston is packed to the limit every single day. I am convinced if we could build that line, it would make money. I'm convinced.
I thank the gentlelady. We don't want to get into too much of a debate with a member at this point because we do have a large panel of witnesses and we're going to have votes. So thank you so much, Ms. Poloni. I'll ask the other witnesses if they can begin occupying their seat. We have Karen Hedlund, and she is the Deputy Administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration. We have Joe Boardman, the President and CEO of Amtrak, as a witness. We have Joan McDonald, Chair of the Northeast Corridor Infrastructure Operations Advisory Commission, and also Commissioner of the New York State Department of Transportation. We have Richard Geddes, Adjunct Scholar of the American Enterprise Institute. We have Mr. Perry Offutt, who is the Managing Director of Morgan Stanley, and Mr. John Tolman, who's Vice President, National Legislative Representative, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. I want to welcome all of our witnesses. We're trying to get to as many as we can. They're going to call a vote in a few minutes. So if you have a lengthy statement, it will be submitted by unanimous consent to the record. I would like to have you summarize, and then when we finish with everyone, we'll go to questions. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll turn first to Karen Hedlund, and she is the Deputy Administrator of FRA. Welcome, and you're recognized, ma'am.
Chairman Mica and Ranking Member, thank you very much for inviting me.
Pull that up as close as you can. It's a little hard to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak to this committee. And, Mr. Chairman, I want to say it's a great honor to testify before this committee during its final hearing with you at the helm. You've achieved significant legislative accomplishments during your tenure, and your oversight and interest in rail programs has really strengthened our agency while improving transportation options throughout the country. And we look forward to continuing to work with you in the coming session. This morning, on behalf of President Obama and Secretary LaHood, I also thank you for this opportunity to discuss our planning and development efforts in the Northeast Corridor, which has been stated as one of the most valuable transportation assets in the United States. And the details about these efforts, which are called NEC Future, are detailed in my written submission. Today, as we look ahead, we know the Northeast region's passenger rail market is as strong and full of potential as any in the country, but clearly the time has come to plan for and invest in the future of the Northeast Corridor. And so we're moving forward with a strategy that is focused on both its immediate and long-term needs. We are overseeing a comprehensive regional planning effort. And this multi-state transportation planning project is one of the largest ever undertaken in the United States. As we look to invest in next generation of NEC services, our initial focus with this planning project is to thoroughly understand the true needs of the market. This is going to be a market-based assessment, and we will know from the very beginning what types of rail services will be needed to meet future demand. We're also seeking innovative ways to enhance the overall planning and environmental process. I know that's an important issue for you. So as part of that effort, early this year, NEC Future was selected by the Council on Environmental Quality as a pilot project that aims to better engage stakeholders and import all the federal and state resource and regulatory agencies early on in the planning process. And we expect that that will produce significant time savings as we go through the entire planning and environmental process. But it's important that we continue to invest in all transportation modes, not just rail. But the public benefits of the Northeast Corridor are central to transportation planning for the following reasons. Transporting more people by trains will take pressure off the region's highways and airports, which, as we all know, are both overburdened and out of room to grow. And when targeted to the market, rail is the most cost-effective, least oil-reliant, and most environmentally friendly mode. Our current investments are adding or upgrading track, untying bottlenecks, modernizing power systems, as has been mentioned, reducing delays at spots such as the Herald interlocking. We're working to upgrade stations from New York to Boston, and we are moving forward with engineering projects to replace some of the most complex and oldest infrastructure, the Portal Bridge, the Susquehanna Bridge, and has been mentioned, Baltimore's B&P Tunnel. These will be enormous undertakings in and of themselves. But I think we can all agree in order to truly position the Northeast Corridor for future demand, we need a vision, we need a framework that will allow this vision to move forward, one that will provide us with an immediately actionable rail investment plan, a blueprint to guide our actions, and we're going to complete this process with an exhaustive public engagement over the next 38 months. Already we've seen what can happen with a big leap, how Amtrak's Acela service came gradually to dominate the air rail market in the region, but we know that there is demand out there currently that is unmet, and that demand will continue to rise. And ultimately, we can't meet that demand without a sustained commitment from the federal government. Today, it's up to us to rise to that challenge, just as we have so many times in the past. And we've been recently reminded of this after Hurricane Sandy, which caused unprecedented damage to the Northeast Corridor. After round-the-clock efforts to restore services, to dewater the tunnels, we saw a crystal clear picture of just how essential the Northeast Corridor is to both the economy of the region and our way of life. It makes you think, what if Alexander Cassatt, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, had listened to his critics back in 1900 and had given up digging those two tunnels across the Hudson River, tunnels that connect New Jersey to Manhattan. Today, Penn Station accommodates 550,000 passengers a day. That's double the passengers that go through the 3 airports of New York. But in 1900, those tunnels were called a boondoggle, too expensive, impossible to build. Some of Cassatt's shareholders probably thought he was nuts. But today, could you imagine New York without it? Well, Sandy showed us what New York looks like without it. So it's up to us now to create the vision, to do the planning, to execute the projects that will ensure we hold true to a basic promise, as the Secretary said last week, that the America we leave for future generations is even greater, even stronger than the America our parents and grandparents left for us. And I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, and we'll hold questions. I just have one quick thing. Have you read Conquering Gotham?
Yes, sir, I have,
okay.
with great interest.
Okay. I was going to make sure you had a copy if you didn't. Mr. Boardman, our Amtrak President CEO, you're recognized. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Mica, and thank you for your service. One of the other things I'd like to thank you about is that you've put a focus on this corridor, and I appreciate that. We put a vision out in September 2010, and by January you began to have a hearing. By February of that year, and I'd just like to summarize quickly because I know you want to move through here quickly, by February of that year we proposed the Gateway Project to support that vision and high-speed rail. In March, we named the U.S. DOT named us as a federal corridor. You already identified that. By May, we were awarded $450 million to improve the speed in New Jersey on what we call a raceway. By June, we were in a situation where we had a peer review by our European and Asian high-speed rail operators validating our proposal of next-generation high-speed rail. In August, we began a business and financial plan with KPMG to understand how we can work the private sector in, how the public-private partnerships might work in that process. In November, the board approved the Amtrak strategic plan, which included the creation of the investment and infrastructure development business line. In February of 2012, the FRA launched the Northeast Corridor Future, which was a comprehensive planning initiative to prepare this corridor, which was necessary for us to move forward with. By July, Amtrak was, and you were there, and we appreciate that. Amtrak was a signature sponsor and a participant in the 8th World Congress for high-speed rail, and it was the first to take place in the United States. We also updated and integrated the high-speed rail vision at that point in time with the Northeast Corridor Master Plan. And we completed the Northeast Corridor Business and Finance Plan at that point. Just this past September, we, using the Acela Express equipment, we operated at speed tests of up to 165 miles an hour in order to demonstrate that we could do those kinds of speeds in several locations along the corridor for improvement. And this morning, what I want to tell you is that we're not going to add any additional trains to or cars to the Acelas the way that we had originally planned. They're too expensive, and they were also, what we really need to do is to replace the Acelas with a new set of train and equipment. And our expectation is that we'll have an RFI, a request for information, in February or early this next year to make that happen. I've told our folks they need to get this done by the time I'm 70, and I'll be 64 next week. Thank you.
Thank you, and let me now recognize and welcome Joan McDonald, who's chair of the Northeast Corridor Infrastructure and Operations Advisory Commission. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Mica. Good morning. Good morning, Congressman Nadler. It's good to see you from my home state, and members of the committee. The Northeast Corridor Commission was authorized by Congress in recognition of the inherent challenges of coordinating, financing, and implementing major system improvements that cross multiple jurisdictions. The expectation, as you laid out, is that by coming together, we will take collective responsibility for the Northeast Corridor. Realizing a bolder vision for the future does require unprecedented collaboration. Comprehensive planning is difficult for a system that spans 8 states and the District of Columbia, supports 9 passenger rail operations, supports 4 freight railroads, and has 4 separate infrastructure owners. The Northeast Corridor line, as everyone knows, is one of the busiest and most complex railroads in the world. It carries over 2,200 commuter, intercity, and freight trains every weekday. These trains carry over 750,000 passengers daily. The Northeast Corridor must balance acute investment needs just to maintain the safety and reliability of current services, and need to address growing service demands. Hundreds of the corridor's bridges and tunnels are more than a century old, and major portions of the corridor's electric power supply were installed in the 1930s. And echoing my fellow colleagues on the panel, we see what happened with the electric system during Hurricane Sandy. The fact that commuter and Amtrak services intersect at common facilities inevitably means delays to anyone's service could quickly cascade and adversely affect the on-time performance of all rail services. With major segments at or near capacity, all services that utilize the corridor are increasingly susceptible to service disruptions resulting from infrastructure failures. In January, the Commission will be releasing a report on the corridor's critical infrastructure investment needs. Input to the report was provided by Amtrak, the corridor states, and the freight railroads through a collaborative process. While 9 states are part of this organization and this commission, and we recognize that the assets are in individual states, we recognize that those assets transcend geographical boundaries. It is one corridor. The Commission's authorizing legislation directs that we develop a cost allocation methodology for use of the corridor that ensures that there is no cross-subsidization between intercity, commuter, and freight rail service. Our aim is for this process to set a foundation for increased federal and state investment in the corridor's infrastructure. In return for increased state investment, we are exploring options to address the governance of the corridor to ensure that the states are equal partners in the decision-making process. Our goal is to have a recommended cost allocation methodology by the end of this fiscal year. We are also engaged in activities examining the long-term rail needs in partnership with the FRA's Northeast Corridor Future program. Hurricane Sandy gave us all a vision into the chaos that would ensue without the vital rail assets that are so critical to the economy of our region. We all watched as our elected leaders prioritized the reconnection of rail service to get the region moving again. We commend the railroad and transit employees who made heroic efforts to restore these services as quickly as possible. The Northeast Corridor is a national resource, and along with the I-95 corridor, the transportation backbone of the Northeast region. However, the corridor's current path is unsustainable. The reliability of existing service is threatened by capacity choke points and significant state of good repair needs. Meeting our future needs due to increasing demand for these services is simply not possible without significant investment in new capacity. In short, the Commission is planning for the future at the same time that we are looking to address the very significant challenges that the corridor is facing today. On behalf of my fellow Commissioners, in closing, I want to extend our appreciation for this committee's strong support for the Northeast Corridor, and we look forward to continuing this partnership. In particular, I want to thank you, Chairman Mica, for your support of the Northeast Corridor, and we look forward to a continued dialogue with you. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll now recognize Mr. Geddes, and he is an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Mica. I appreciate the opportunity to be back and speaking to the committee once again. And just wanted to note that in addition to my affiliation with the American Enterprise Institute, I'm an associate professor at Cornell University in the Department of Policy Analysis. and management, and that just this semester with a Cornell grad, John Foote, class of '74 engineering grad whose company developed EasyPass, we have started a new program and infrastructure policy at Cornell, and I have some information about that, and that is to educate future generations of students and young people on the important issues that this committee addresses. And I hope to be able to work with the committee in the future and hopefully with yourself in developing this program. In fact, I think it's the one of only 2 such programs that are currently operational in the United States focusing on infrastructure policy, the other one being at the University of Minnesota. So I'd just like to draw everyone's attention to that and seek your advice on that. I want to address a few things regarding the topic that the committee is focusing on today, which is the Northeast Corridor's future and options for high-speed rail development and private sector participation in transportation. There's a couple of key issues I'd like to address. The first is to get a concept on the table that I think is extremely relevant for this debate that is, I believe, absent, which is the concept of a residual claim. Sounds like sort of an academic concept, but I think very important, a residual claim as well as residual claimants. Second, I want to be clear about the value that I think private participation in the Northeast Corridor can bring to the nation in several different ways. And third, I'd like to emphasize that the gains from private participation, as judging from a number of economic studies that focus on this, do not come from reducing wages or reducing employment once you get more private participation. They come from increased value creation and value capture due to the incentives and the skills of the private sector partners that you bring in. I also want to emphasize that through competitive public-private partnerships, it's possible for the public sector to realize the value associated with private participation now through upfront concession payments that we've seen. So the public sector does not have to wait to realize these benefits. I want to emphasize that a residual claim is defined as a property right to the profits from a given economic activity. That is, who actually has a right to obtain the value that they create from undertaking new efforts in economic activity. This is a key public policy issue for the Northeast Corridor. The question is, are the property rights to the value creation from additional investment and effort clearly assigned to some well-defined group? I think it's difficult to overstate the importance of this, and I don't think they are at present. One of the key things that private participation does is to introduce clear, well-defined residual claimants who have a right to capture the value that they create by better using the current assets that we have on the Northeast Corridor. Private participation creates such well-defined residual claimants. From this fact of the impact of bringing in private participation and residual claimants, a number of important social benefits can be obtained. Those include the expertise and skills of the private sector. Those include the sharp, focused incentives that you get from private participation that you do not currently have. And they also include access to new types of capital, particularly equity capital, which is risk-taking capital, that is critical. Those 3 aspects of private participation would bring enormous social benefits to increase private participation on the Northeast Corridor. I want to note also that there's inherent risks, substantial risks, in these types of activities that are currently entirely being borne by taxpayers. One of the key benefits of bringing private participants into this situation is that you have people who are experts in bearing risk. That's a service that they provide, is a risk-bearing service, and they make the cost of that risk-bearing transparent. I think that's actually an enormous benefit of bringing private participation in. I'll just close by noting that one of the, I think, underappreciated benefits of private participation is the fact that the public sector can realize that value immediately through competitive bidding by competing groups of potential private participants in a number of areas. Suppose it's operating a train station, for example, and you can concession that out, receive an upfront concession payment, as Maryland did on some of the I-95 rest stops that I noted in my testimony, and that's one major advantage of bringing in private participation that is not reliant on negative effects on labor. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll stop there.
Well, I thank you, and pleased to recognize the Managing Director of Morgan Stanley, Mr. Perry Offit. Welcome, sir, and you're recognized. Sorry about the delay.
No problem, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having me. My group works...
I pull that up real close because we can't hear you.
Hopefully that's better. Thank you again for having me this morning. My group focuses on working with clients both on the public and private sector, trying to seek out opportunities where private capital can be used to invest in U.S. infrastructure. As a financial advisor focused on this area, I appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective on some of the key considerations that could affect interest from the private sector, both financial investors, construction companies, and rail operators in participating in the design, construction, operation, maintenance, and financing of a high-speed rail project along the Northeast Corridor. Public-private partnership structures have been used for numerous construction projects and have demonstrated that the private sector, one, can often build a project more quickly and at a lower cost, two, drive efficiencies over time by introducing technology solutions, and three, develop incremental revenue sources by delivering additional services. While there hasn't been a public-private partnership or P3 transaction involving a U.S. high-speed rail project, there are similar greenfield P3 transactions that can provide a guideline for financing this project. I also believe that there are numerous companies interested in high-speed rail in the U.S., given their experience building and operating high-speed rail systems internationally, specifically in Europe and Asia. These operators and construction companies would join bidding groups with financial investors to bid on the right to design, build, operate, maintain, and finance this project. After being pre-qualified, the winning bidder is usually chosen based on lowest cost. One of the key considerations is if the project generates enough operating cash flow, the private sector would be compensated over time for their investment by receiving the net revenues generated from the project. However, if the project does not generate adequate annual net revenue, the bidding groups will require an ongoing revenue supplement from a government entity known as an availability payment to ensure that they'll be able to cover their cost and earn an adequate return on their investment. If the revenues reach a certain level, the availability payments could go away and the concessionaire would only be entitled to the project's revenue. As a result, the availability payment could be structured as a floor to support an investment-grade financing and attract maximum private investor interest. Given the existing passenger rail footprint in the Northeast and high population density in key urban areas, the project would be a very profitable operation. And the private sector could also rely heavily on significant historical traffic information along the Northeast Corridor and be very confident about their estimates regarding ridership. As I previously mentioned, one of the primary reasons for entering into a P3 transaction is to transfer risk of construction and operations to the private sector. However, private investors will also expect some comfort from the government on a few important risks associated with the project. One, how potential cost overruns will be dealt with, especially if they occur as a result of government action. Two, ensuring some level of protection against government investments in future competing transportation infrastructure. And three, assessing the political support for the project at the federal, state, and local levels. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify this morning on this very important topic, and I'd be glad to answer any questions later.
Well, thank you, and we'll hold questions. So I've got now the Vice President and National Legislative Representative of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. Welcome back, Mr. Tolman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the opportunity to be here on behalf of the 36,000 active members of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, Teamsters, and over 70,000 rail conference members. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, Mr. Chairman, and for your services to this committee. It's truly an honor to me to be here at your last hearing as the chairman of this committee. I've appeared before this body many times in the last several years and always enjoyed your questions and comments, and look forward to working with you and members of this committee into the 113th Congress. But thank you. Today I'd just like to talk about a personal experience as a locomotive engineer on Amtrak, as well as a BLET's position on Amtrak's progress and successes in the Northeast Corridor. I also would like to compare to other countries' passenger rail high-speed service as they relate to privatization. I was an Amtrak engineer in the operating trains in the Northeast Corridor in the mid-'70s and in early '90s. From its inception, I remember Amtrak being chronically underfunded. I remember Amtrak, as a young man, I remember coming down here some 2 decades ago, trying to secure some funding for Amtrak to preserve a safe and reliable rail passenger service and save the jobs of my fellow employees, all professional and highly skilled workers. Now, 20 years later, I'm still fighting the same fight. I remember running test trains in the Northeast Corridor at 150 miles an hour with a 40-year-old diesel and passenger cars that are over 40 years old. I've seen the growth and I've seen improvements in the Northeast Corridor, from electrification of the main line and improved crossovers for high-speed trains. While positive train control made national headlines the last several years, Amtrak has had a form of PTC in the Northeast Corridor for almost 20 years. All this while Amtrak's funding is a fraction of that spent on other modes and by other countries. It's frankly embarrassing to compare government funding for Amtrak with U.S. government funding for domestic aviation and highways, and passenger rail funding for European and Asian countries. To build and maintain one of the best highway systems in the world, we've spent $114 billion and built it over 35 years. In today's dollars, it would be $426 billion. But times have changed. Congestion on our roads are at historic levels, and by the year 2020, 90% of urban interstates will be either at or over capacity. And as anyone who's had the pleasure of flying recently knows, the serious problems that plague our nation's airports: flight delays, cancellation, overcrowding planes. In fact, in spite of all this, Amtrak now carries more riders from New York to Boston than all other airlines put together. 50% of all the people that travel this distance. And between Washington, D.C. and New York City, Amtrak carries more than twice as many passengers as all airlines combined. Today, it carries 75% of inner city travelers between New York and Washington. Amtrak has done all this with the threat of funding cuts and privatization, especially of the profitable Northeast Corridor, hanging over its head. We know that in other parts of the world, privatization of high-speed passenger rail has been tried and has failed to solve the problems it was intended to solve. These plans were almost always preceded by funding cuts, systemic safety and reliability problems, caused a great deal of upheaval in the transportation, and forced countries to renationalize the system. With that being said, we think that Amtrak's long-term, next-gen plan for the Northeast Corridor provides a template for a public-private partnership that is worth discussing. If the partnership does not reduce the public interest or the interests of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers members and Amtrak's other professional and skilled workers. Further, the BLET believes that Amtrak should continue to be the service provider for the Northeast Corridor and across the United States because they have provided progressive, quality service despite many, many obstacles, and continue to look for ways to increase train speed, reliability, and service in spite of these obstacles. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and thank all of our panelists, particularly for your patience while we had to exercise our constitutional responsibility, and that's vote. We're back now, finished the panel, and we'll turn to questions. Let me just comment to Mr. Tolman and welcome to on behalf of labor representing men and women that work for us. Appreciate your role. As I've said repeatedly, and sometimes I wonder if people have a hearing disability, can't comprehend what I'm saying. I've always advocated maintaining the benefits, the salary, the wages, the retirement for Amtrak employees in whatever structure we adopt, making certain that's protected. I've also been here and watched the number of personnel from Amtrak go from 29,000 to 19,000, and I say that doesn't portend a bright future for labor, either if you're the head of a union or labor organization or a member. I've been there fighting for labor when labor had to fight Amtrak and the federal government for benefits and wages. In fact, that was a prolonged and difficult experience for the people who work for Amtrak, those union members who were denied benefits and wages, and always use the example of freight rail, which is taken over, which very often gives better salary, better wages, and reaches agreements without that type of imposition. And as far as my record, I have always supported the right of Americans to join a labor union. When we wrote the TSA legislation, I insisted that we have that right. I also take the position that no one should be forced to join or compelled to join a union. But I think that's an important right, and I think that labor has done an incredible job over the years. There have been some problems here and there, but in raising the standards, the compensation, the working conditions for the people that get out there and roll up their sleeves and actually make things happen rather than like Congress or bureaucrats just talk about it. So I want to make that perfectly clear, and as we move forward, I think that again, they're just unlimited possibilities. If we can have 4 times the number of passengers, I know we can increase the employment. We already actually, technically, Amtrak is a private corporation. It is does have some quasi-governmental characteristics and certainly substantial government support. There have been debates about the level of support, but furthermore, I've always supported long-distance service, a national system, but we want that to be operated and managed on the very best basis, because the chief underwriters of the subsidies of the private sector corporation that we have with Amtrak and created in '71, the main underwriters are the taxpayers of the United States. So that's all I've asked for. And then I think our goal is to have high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor. I think that's your goal, Mr. Tolman, correct? Yeah. You'd support that?
Positively.
But, okay. But we want to do that rather than in 30 years. 30 years, to my calculation, brings us, and their chart, which we'll put in the record without objection, shows us not getting to really high-speed operations until 2030 to 2040. At that juncture, I won't be around to see that, all given my DNA and longevity on as far as male members of my family are concerned. So my goal is to see it while I'm alive and not to have it happen after I'm pushing daisies out of some better setting. But with those words, questions, we've got Mr. Boardman. I have to thank. Let me go to Headland first. I brought a copy of Conquering Gotham. Has everybody read that on the panel? Have you read that, Boardman? No. If Mr. Boardman has not. Would the staff please take this down, present this copy, and I'm going to autograph it for him. If you think, let's see.
That's how I get books.
To Joe, from John with love. Okay, but if you think you're having problems after you read this, a story of Alexander Cassatt's attempts to bring rail service into Manhattan, the tunnels that he built, Union Station that he built. You think your politics have been tough. Wait till you read this story. It's one of the most fascinating volumes I have ever read, and it encapsulates all the issues that we're going through. And he was determined to do this. They were originally going to build another bridge up in the northern part of Manhattan to connect. Up to that time, about 10, 12 rail lines went in. The major one, I guess, was the Pennsylvania Railroad that he had. And then people had to take a ferry from New Jersey to New York. And his sister was an accomplished artist, Mary Cassatt, who had a studio in Paris. So during his visits, he observed the French tunneling. And so he came back and said, hell, if the French could tunnel, we can too. Adopted that plan. They had actually failed, and you'll read that story too in this volume, in trying to build a tunnel previous to that. But he did succeed. It's just an incredible story of vision and just the type of determination to get the job done. But would the staff, one of the staffers, deliver that at this point to Mr. Boardman? Thank you.
Thanks for bringing that up, Ken.
All right. But again, it does take that vision, and it takes also the determination, and also, to be quite blunt, it takes the cash. Now, I was excited about President Obama committing to high-speed rail. However, I did express my disappointment in that the money was diverted among 150 projects. Most of the money went to California for a true high-speed rail. The rest was intercity enhanced passenger service and a number of other improvements and grants. What is for the FRA representative and administrator, deputy administrator, what is the intent of the administration for high-speed rail in the future, the next 4 years? Can you?
Well, I think the President's vision is in his budget, and it includes additional billions of dollars for high-speed rail. And so it is spelled out in his budget. He continues to be quite committed to it, and we hope that the Congress will follow through on that.
Okay. Well, Mr. Boardman, and you started out with, I think, less than $100 million, and some of the money that came into the Northeast Corridor came in I guess at the same time we designated the corridor high speed, which I commend you on doing. But secondly, with the return of money from at least Florida, Wisconsin, and Ohio, and designated. And Mr. Boardman, you're using that in some. I don't mean this to be critical, but it's sort of a Band-Aid approach of because you don't have the money, but you're trying to pick projects that would make a major impact in improvements in the speed of that corridor. Where are you on Gateway as far as funding, planning, execution? Where do you see it now, and how much to get that done? And Gateway is, maybe you could describe that too for the record.
Sure. Gateway is a project that basically goes from just past Newark into Penn Station, New York. It involves 2 new tunnels, a new portal bridge, some new tracks that go from basically Lautenberg Center all the way to the new 2 tunnels. And it also includes space within Penn Station for especially New Jersey transit trains that don't have the same ability that Long Island Railroad does to stop quickly and then store their trains on the Hudson Yards or the West Side Yards.
And where are you with that?
We're in a planning stage. Some of the projects could move a little bit quicker than others, and we included that in the after Sandy request, $336 million. And what we really need to do is make sure we secure a space under the Hudson Yards. It's about an 800-foot section at about $190 million, because once that real estate development actually occurs, it would close off the ability to get those 2 new tunnels in. The second thing we really need to do that was going to be done under ARC but also would be done under Gateway is to raise to a platform or to a different location that sub 41 station that was flooded during the tunnel, and also add high-density signal systems on the East River tunnels, not so much to add capacity to the station, but to give us the ability to move trains through those East River tunnels more quickly, and we could have restored the same level of service quicker had we been able to do something like that. So those are an additional planning amount of money to move us forward on that project.
Okay, 2 things. One, we're trying to complete an environmental study in the corridor. That's scheduled to be done about 2015. Is that correct?
That's right. It's the Tier 1 for the corridor, which will set the framework for the entire corridor, and then you go into Tier 2, and that process looks at individual projects. Some of the delays that occur in the environmental process come when the individual projects are considered, and the advantage of bringing the resource agencies in early in the beginning of the planning process is that when we get to Tier 2, we can save, we think, significant time because the alternatives will have been narrowed. The resource agencies will have bought into that. You won't have them coming in the way they sometimes do at the end and say, well, you know, we don't like the way you did the analysis, so you have to redo the analysis, or you have to look at 2 or 3 other alternatives that were dismissed early on, but they weren't at the table when that analysis was done. So we are hoping to, as I said, complete the Tier 1 by 2015. By the way, we do need additional funding. The first phase of that, we had $9 million for. That will be completed in February. But the next 2 phases will cost an additional approximately $30 million, and we need additional funding to complete that.
Has that been requested in the budget?
I believe so, but I'll get back to you on that.
Let us know on that. Also, anything we can do to speed that process up. The other thing is, does that include the entire corridor, all 437, or is it just parts of it?
It's the entire corridor.
Is it? I was wondering again if any of this could be divided up and expedited, and that's something else I'd like to look at, discuss with you all. I'll have a little bit more time to focus specifically on the Northeast Corridor after the beginning of the year, and I'd like to make that a priority, moving it forward. But you'll need the money if you're going to complete the plan. Then when we get that, we will have alternatives analysis.
Yes.
Okay. At that point and juncture, now we had Secretary LaHood here, and he was talking about overall high-speed rail, and he said we will also need the money. He said he would be open to opening these opportunities to private sector competition. Do you see any problem with that?
No, as he said last week, and I think he's been quite consistent on this, we welcome private sector investment to be able to leverage the limited public funds that are available. We're going to want to make sure that where that money comes in makes the most amount of sense, is the most cost-effective way to do it, that the contracts are put together in a way that protect the public interest.
Exactly. I would concur with all of those. Right. Particularly, our job is protecting the public interest, and also I think it's important that we maintain the ownership of that infrastructure that we're contributing to build along the way. But I think, one, you're never going to get the Congress to give you $151 billion billion, even over a period of 30 years. But I think if we could attract private capital, and that's where our managing director of Morgan Stanley maybe could shed some light. Right now we take in about $1 billion. We have about 11 or 12 million passengers on that run. If that was 40 million passengers, of course there's cost, not just adding passengers, but capacity and the infrastructure to support that. How much money do you think could be raised? Any thumbnail idea of what that kind of activity would support that revenue? We'd probably have about $4 billion coming in from passenger revenue at that stage, and it could be amortized over a number of years. Maybe you could tell us what that might foretell or forecast for investment. And you, I think both, well, I know you said there have to be conditions, government guarantee and backup, which could be done. But with that kind of revenue, what kind of investment would it support?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's hard to put, obviously, a precise number on this, of course, but what I would say is we're in an environment where there is more and more capital being raised to invest in infrastructure projects globally than there are actual opportunities to invest that. And I say that because there are a lot of projects that really are not profitable and are very difficult to make the math work from a business standpoint. The Northeast Corridor, we believe, or I believe, is definitely an exception to that. It's profitable currently, and I think with additional investment could be a lot more profitable.
Well, again, if we had $4 billion in revenue versus $1 billion, what would that support? Any idea? I mean, you take that to the market. There's a lot of expenses involved, but there's still going to be a nice net return. Would it support 20, 30 billion, 40 in investment? I don't know.
It would definitely come in kind of two forms. It would be private debt capital and private equity capital. And the reason I differentiate that is that I think with that steady type of cash flow, what people would get comfortable with is when you look at the cash flow that's available for debt service, and let's assume after all the cost and all of that, that you get to something, you know, in excess of, you know, $2 billion of that, you could argue that that there's at least basically it's hard to give an exact number, but I mean there's clearly multiples of that would get you comfortable for just pure debt service that could come from the markets. These numbers, it's hard to there is no other project like this because it's so huge relative to what people have been investing in the past.
But again, there would be interest. There's capital now seeking projects of this nature. One of course of this magnitude might have a great deal of interest, but we've got. My main thing is to get our alternatives, get this environmental study done, then look at the possibility and take proposals from the private sector to build this out. Of course, and whoever the operator is or working with Amtrak has to also honor the labor agreements and well, I think. You know, I'm looking at it, trying to look at it from a positive standpoint of what we could do. There's so many benefits, as I said, the air traffic congestion. Even with next generation air traffic control, which won't be developed in the quickest, I'm trying to speed that up to with some things we're doing, maybe 15 years. You can only fly so many planes so closely together. They can only land so many planes at LaGuardia. JFK and Newark, been there and watched them land and can see that we're maximizing, even with the Stewart addition of the fourth airport, you still will run out of airspace. But taking this traffic to the corridor and then the connections that we have, a question was raised by Ms. Brown about impeding some of the service along the way. Actually, if it's properly done and there is separation, we can enhance local passenger service, commuter service, and we can also increase freight traffic by, again, separation within the corridor the right plan. So I look forward to working with you, Mr. Boardman, with the Deputy Administrator and others, and thank you for participating today. We're going to leave the record open until the 31st of December. How's that for a date, Ms. Norton? Without objection, so ordered. We may have additional questions we'll submit to you. May I yield to Ms. Norton now?
Well, that's a fine date, Mr. Chairman. It will either be over the cliff or not by that time. I very much appreciate this hearing. I want to say that I have been an aficionado of public-private projects in my own subcommittee on economic development, where it's better known, better understood, and extensively used. I have, and therefore I'm very interested in its conceivable application to a railroad. If we did more public-private partnerships in construction and real estate in my other committee, we would have saved billions of dollars. Now I want to see whether or not that's the same if we're talking about railroads. I noticed in Mr. Offutt's testimony, I'm looking at page 9, that your examples where you would recently advised, as you say, on transactions, tend to be examples like parking systems, concessions, parking concessions, airports, and the like. Have you ever advised on any project as large or as extensive as the Northeast Corridor?
I'd say there are a lot of projects I've worked on that are very similar, and in terms of airports, there's lots of complexity that are very unique to airports. But I would say this is a very unique project relative to anything that I've seen in the U.S. or around the globe in terms of the scope of what this project could be, especially as it relates to cost. So I think it's not just probably me speaking, it would probably be anyone in the financial community have been used to seeing transactions where an equity check from a large institutional investor of $1 billion is considered large, and this would be something which could support significantly more than that if structured appropriately.
Now, you testify that capital is available for investment in such a project like the Northeast Corridor. Now, our recent experience, I'd like you to describe what you think is the reason for our recent experience, where the Department of Transportation put out requests for proposals, did get a few, but none for the Northeast Corridor. Why do you think that the DOT got none for the Northeast Corridor, since that's the only really profitable one?
So one, I'd start with just looking at the example of the Florida high-speed rail project, which had been considered at one point in time, and there was a list of groups that had formed that expressed interest in that, and they were really, truly kind of some of the best operators around the world for high-speed rail, some of the best construction companies, and some very well-known equity sources as well. So I think there's a lot of interest in general, but what the private sector has seen multiple times before are projects that are still very much in the conceptual stage and are very concerned about spending significant dollars today until there's some more clarity on the projects, because they do cost obviously a lot of money to have consultants and others analyze it. And that's why I mentioned the concept of political will in my testimony. Not that on both sides of the House there's clearly support for projects like this, but there's a lot of details that need to be dealt with in terms of what the actual economics may be, and then once those are determined, then I think there would be a lot of interest from the private sector.
You know, you say, and now I'm looking at page 6 of your pardon me, testimony, that equity contribution from private investors tends to be approximately 10 to 15% of the total project cost, given its cost of capital. Does that sound like it would be sufficient for a bidder who wanted to be the private partner in the Northeast Corridor?
And I think that's a question for obviously a lot of other people that would be involved in the project, if that is enough, and if you think about the total needs for capital, how much would you need from the private sector to close that gap? But when you do look at precedent public-private partnership transactions in the U.S., and it's still a more limited subset than if you look over in Australia, Canada, and the UK, they tend to be only about 10 to 15% money comes from the private sector in terms of equity, that is. And it really is because the cost of capital for that equity is definitely, based on precedent deals, north of 10% cost of capital. So usually for projects such as this, they would start with any potential grant money available first, then maybe any potential subsidized or low-cost loans, such as the RIF program, and then eventually figure out how much more additional capital would be needed, and could the private sector be able to come up with that amount. And again, given the size of the total project, I think we haven't had the ability to say if there is enough capital to do that. But in segments, and given the general interest in rail, I believe that if structured appropriately, there should be a way to do this.
But you do say 10 to 15% of the total project cost would come from private capital. Now, where does the rest come from?
That's right. So if you look at a lot of the projects, for example, some of the toll road projects that were built in Florida, a lot of it comes from either federal or state funds. And so I should say that it's not to say these are grants, but a lot of times they're programs like TIFIA, which are low-cost loans that would be supported by the project that represent, and given where the TIFIA program is now, roughly 50% of a total project cost. So the actual
might be low-cost loans guaranteed by the government.
That's where a large percentage have come from historically.
Sure. Often, we're going to move on. We'll come back. We're going to have several rounds here. Along that same line of questioning, what percentage do you look when you're looking at a project? What percentage of the project do you normally look at as being needed to be funded before private capital comes in, and then what type of return are you looking for?
So the clients on the private side that spend time with, obviously they're going to look at a return that's consistent with the risk of a project. If there is an availability payment as a floor, as I mentioned in my testimony, where there's at least some comfort that no matter what the volume of traffic is, that there is some base level of cash flow, that drives the return expectation down to somewhere in the low double digits, so maybe 11, 12%. If you're talking about a project where there's a lot more volatility, and then the project for a greenfield new construction project could be in the kind of 17, 18, to 20% type returns. So I think the reality is that these investors who represent a lot of times pension fund money or endowment money are looking to deploy that capital on a global basis, and will find projects that meet those return hurdles. So that's why usually the percentage is a much smaller percentage of the total cost. I think the first part of your question, as it relates to figuring out when that money is available, there's definitely money that's been raised, so everyone knows that. But I think when it comes down to thinking about any given project, if the total cost for a theoretical project was $1 billion, there would be very much a calculation of, given the project's future cash flows and given what other sources of capital could be available from both federal, state, local funds, to forms of debt capital that could be funded on a project basis, on a taxable basis, or even a tax-exempt basis, then how much would be left over for this private equity capital, and that usually happens after significant studies have happened in terms of either ridership, environmental, and so on, and that there's enough certainty on what the timeline of that project might be as well.
So at what point, and also what type of information do you need before you present this to your investors on investing in the Northeast Corridor?
I believe there are a couple of processes that are going on right now in terms of a ridership study that would be incredibly helpful. There's additional work, I believe, in terms of analyzing what if any kind of environmental work would be needed. Things that would be able to develop a financial set of projections based on certain reputable advisors or consultants that would be backing those numbers. I think once there's a real set of projections, both on the capital side and the operations side, then I think it becomes a very tangible analysis that the private sector can get involved in, at least in terms of, again, more on the equity investment side.
And what type of information are you looking for coming from, or what type of commitment are you looking for from Congress on the overall project? Is there a percentage that you're looking for? If it's a $100 billion project, are you looking for 80% of it to be initially funded, or are you normally willing to jump in halfway through the process?
Sure. There definitely is not a specific percentage that's required. It truly just becomes down to math. I think it's math in terms of making sure that the return is reached. It's also, there is a limit in terms of how much equity capital would be invested in any one given project. So while I mentioned in my testimony, and there's been other mentions about hundreds of billions of dollars that's been raised, that's true. Some of that, clearly a large chunk of that has been invested. But any different fund advisor is going to be limited by how much they're going to be able to put in one given project. So again, the numbers we've talked about are kind of unprecedented relative to deals that have actually happened.
I'm just curious on what point you actually get the information and take that back to your investors, and what point you're able to not only present that to them, but give a commitment overall to the project. If this is a $151 billion project that has $3 billion, a little over $3 billion already allocated to it, at what point, do you get involved in a phase, or do you need to see a certain amount of budget allocated before you're able to put your financial picture together for your investors?
I think there's definitely the ability, again, for the broader private sector, not only to the investors, but clearly the operators and construction companies, to be getting involved in early stages of the phase to try to give their thoughts and try to structure things in a way that they think will ultimately get to the right conclusion. And given the size and the scope of this project, I would think you clearly would have different phases for that to happen. Where they will spend clearly their most time and effort is when there's a better sense of when that first phase will actually start or get close to kind of the construction portion, and then that way, maybe the 6 months leading up to that is clearly where all the funding will have to come together, and again, all the kind of private and public funds will be available.
So in a huge project like this, it does not make your investors nervous to get involved in a phase one or a phase two, or an early part of the process, even though the overall budget is not put together?
I think it's just a matter of managing their kind of cost and time from the perspective of, I think a lot of people would believe in this project in the long run and would be happy to dedicate a fair amount to try to make the process move forward. I think it's a matter of, in some of these cases, they could spend personally themselves, millions of dollars trying to analyze the project and come up with constructs that might make the procurement of it work, but also are concerned about, is that money going to be something which they're going to be able to recover eventually if there is a process. So it's a long way of saying that they are very mindful of how much they do spend up front, but I do find that they would probably be very much willing to engage at some point early on, and then hope that they've kind of helped give some guidance that could be that could actually turn into a process they could be involved in later.
So you would write a clause into any contract that said if the project significantly changes, then there's some type of payment back to your investors?
That's one way of doing it. I think that there are people on the private side that are willing to have funds at risk where they could say, given a certain amount of that they would spend out of their pocket, that they would not expect to be recovered at all. But I think there have been discussions about ways in which you can engage the private sector and give them some comfort that if things do deviate dramatically, that they could be, maybe not recover 100%, but recover something for their time and efforts. That'd be helpful.
And how much does that compensation change depending on the risk that's allocated, or how much does the risk change depending on how early the project is?
I mean, obviously, the kind of the earlier stage and the less and less defined a project is, the riskier it is. And I'd say that what's tough is there aren't any specific at least in terms of the equity capital side, specific funds dedicated just to kind of passenger rail projects. So I think it would be trying to figure out, which groups would be the most interested in kind of taking that risk. And the groups that I've heard of would clearly be kind of a lot of the international operators that are, one which obviously Amtrak has teamed up with before is, SNCF, the French operators, I think are very much believers in this project and other projects in the U.S., and I believe have been willing to kind of give guidance on, and not expect any kind of compensation in return.
Thank you. And one final question. This is a $151 billion project? $151 billion project with $3.3 billion allocated from the federal government. Is there local bond on this? State bond? Any type of bond? No bond? Okay, so comparing that to California, where you've got a now $68 billion project with $3.6 billion coming from the federal government, a $9.95 billion bond, you've got a bigger percentage already allocated between state and federal dollars for the California high-speed rail. Which is a better risk? Which would be a better investment for Morgan Stanley?
I think the investors would definitely view that the Northeast Corridor, given at least the view that you're going to be able to go from Boston to Washington, D.C., even if it's, again, not all done in one segment initially, it's already profitable, and it clearly has room to be significantly more profitable. California, until you're able to get from the two major areas of density in San Francisco to L.A., if you're only talking about the Central Valley, I think that becomes a proposition, unless if there's this kind of guaranteed availability payment that I had mentioned before, then no one's going to be willing to take that traffic risk because there is no history of large traffic between Bakersfield and Fresno.
But at some point, you're still going to connect, by the California plan, San Francisco to L.A. If you've got $68 billion project and you've got a much larger investment between state and federal dollars, why wouldn't that be less risk, unless you really have a huge question about the ridership numbers between the two corridors?
Yeah, I think it maybe all really goes to phases. I think it's hard to say which is better if both of them were built tomorrow and they were done. I think they both actually in the U.S. are both very interesting and potentially very viable projects. I think it's just it's difficult to be able to convince the private sector that the timeline is going to be within a reasonable amount of time. Most of these funds have been raised to try to be invested over the next 10 years, and a project such as the California one clearly has a timeline that could be well beyond that.
Thank you. Mr. Hanna. Ms. Norton?
I'd like to, I'm fascinated by the public-private notion and how real it is. Did you say you'd expect 11 to 12% return on investment?
So when you think about the private capital, there's definitely debt capital and equity capital, obviously. On the equity side, I would say that the base rate, so the lowest possible rate that equity would be willing to receive would be a return of 10 to 11%. And that would be under a structure where most, if not all, of their key risks were mitigated. So specifically traffic risk for either a portion or all of the system. So that just gives you a sense of how much more expensive that is, obviously relative to the RIF program, which is based on treasuries and other types of funding sources.
For the record, the $3.3 billion that was spoken of earlier, that's really Recovery Act money and some appropriation money. It is going into, for lack of a better word, Mr. Boardman could perhaps elaborate, I would call basic upkeep, not even upgrade of the kind that would be necessary to prepare for high-speed rail. Is that true, Mr. Boardman? Isn't this just getting Amtrak so that those trains can run safely and on time, as they say?
Yeah, Ms. Norton, I'm not entirely familiar with the $3.3 billion number, what it consists of. In terms of the Recovery Act piece, we talked about $336 million, and in terms of investment for high speed, the only thing I really know about is the $450 million that's on the corridor now that came out of the Florida project that we're doing in New Jersey.
So no investment in that we could call high-speed investment yet. I'm asking this because I need clarification from Mr. Offord on infrastructure. Is your view of the private, does your view of the private investment assume that the government has in place and has already funded all the needed infrastructure, or is the private investor part of the infrastructure of the high-speed rail?
It could definitely be structured either way. There are examples, and I guess that, when the Florida high-speed rail project was considered, the idea that 100% of the capital costs could have been funded through government funds, and then that the private sector would be taking the responsibility of all the operating costs going forward. That was kind of one concept that had been discussed. I think as it relates,
moving right along.
Right. So yeah, exactly. So I don't know if the Northeast Corridor would be that way or not. I think there clearly are examples where a large percentage of the, or for other projects, a large percentage of the capital costs would also be covered by the private sector. I think that in this case, just given the magnitude, there just aren't. It's just. I guess I should keep emphasizing it's unprecedented. So it's not to say it can't be done. It's just.
Well, I can understand that, Mr. Offord, and some of the questions we're asking you are almost impossible. I think one of the reasons that perhaps if one was going to do anything, one ought to do it on a section of the Northeast Corridor and see what you got. But we do have some rough analogies that trouble me when I try to apply them to a railroad that has to go and can't stop and is dependent upon, and that's the FAA. I saw the FAA bill held up here year after year after year. Neither party seemed to be able to move it. Finally got to the point where on airports around the country, they had to stop all of the work on those airports because Congress had failed to pass its bill, its public part of the bill. Could I ask you whether, the public-private partnership of the kind you're talking about is even suited for the way we fund projects? We fund projects on an annual basis. That means that the federal, on an annual appropriation basis. So that means that unless there was also negotiated a way to keep whatever government funds were part of this deal coming, wouldn't the private-public partnership be in the same position as the FAA was? In some years where there's nothing, because there's no agreement in Congress. This is democracy, and the way in which it works, particularly when it comes to money, is sometimes Congress does and sometimes Congress doesn't. And I'm trying to apply that to a railroad, which depends through the annual appropriations on Congress coming up with its share of the operating funds, and I'm having trouble.
I completely agree with that point. There, for much smaller scale projects that, for example, a courthouse was built in Long Beach, California, and it was all of the funds are also subject to appropriation that are coming from the government each year. But given the scale of that being so much smaller, the investor felt comfortable that money will come. I think when you're talking about the magnitude here and the costs associated with significant delays, it raises it to a whole nother level. That's right.
It seems to me that the infrastructure of the government would have to also be changed to account for any such new and important inroad into public-private partnership for railroads. Thank you very much.
Ms. Hedlund, you said in your testimony that you've got the right pieces and the right people in place. Do you currently have any private investment in the project?
Is there currently any private investment in the Northeast Corridor?
Correct.
Yes, there is, and it's in the stations. As Ms. Norton is familiar with, the Union redevelopment of Union Station involves a significant public-private partnership with a private real estate developer, and the same is true with the proposed redevelopment of Moynihan Station in New York. So, yes, with respect to stations, there is a great opportunity to leverage private investment for the development of those stations to pay for the transportation function of those stations.
And how about as far as phase one of the rail or the environmental process?
What we will be doing in phase one is to evaluate what potential private investment might be. That is definitely part of the scope of work of phase one, so we will be studying that.
And how about phase two? What type of private investment are you looking for in phase two?
Well, we'll find out in phase one what we, that's what phase one is to find out, is to what the potential is for private investment for projects going forward.
Unlike in California, the Northeast Corridor service provides, my numbers here show 75% of the rail air market. What's the proportion of passenger rail transport in the air rail market for California?
I don't have those numbers, but I know there's been a study of what the impact of the high-speed rail project would be on the congestion between San Francisco and Los Angeles, how much of that traffic is expected to shift to rail. I don't have those numbers with me, but I'd be happy to get those from the authority and make them available to you in the record.
And you also would have, or the authority would assume it would also have a 30-year projection?
I don't know exactly what the nature of the projections are, but we'll get the information that they have and make it available to you.
Thank you. And you currently have the 30-year projection for the Northeast Corridor?
For the air rail split?
Yeah.
That I do not know. I would defer to Mr. Boardman on this. The introduction of the Acela service itself in 2000, I think the air rail split was something like 30-70 or 40-60, and then it flipped. It's now 75-25. The overwhelming number of people going between Washington, D.C. and New York prefer to take the train, and it's not because that it's always cheaper, because the Acela service is not. It's because of the time savings and the convenience.
Mr. Boardman, for the Northeast Corridor, 80% of the population lives within 25 miles of the Northeast Corridor, making the rail very, very accessible. How would you compare that with California?
Depends on the part of California. One of the things I can answer, Congressman, is that the air rail service between San Diego and L.A. is entirely rail, because it just doesn't work the way that as close as they are to each other and the way that it operates. But when you get to something like the L.A. to San Francisco, you really only got the Coast Starlight, and so there isn't a sufficient amount of data that would really tell you what would really happen here. So from that regard, the old train, and I can't remember right now what they called it, I guess it was the Coast Daylight, was the primary way they moved up until 15 years ago or so between San Francisco and L.A., and it was probably the most profitable of the private railroads back years ago in regard to that. In terms of the Northeast Corridor, we have a projection of what the revenues would be 30 years down the line, and probably very little air service in terms of Boston to Boston to New York and New York to Washington, because you'd be at an hour and a half between Boston and New York, and then another hour and a half or an hour and 34 minutes between New York and Washington. So you would really wind up with very little air service. And that, if you remember back in 2008, and you may not, but there was a great deal of discussion by the aviation, or former aviation executives, that that's something we really should do in the Northeast, so that those airports today could really be used for longer distance travel, and that we use the mode that made the most sense, which would be rail in those corridors. That would garner us, our expectation is, pretty close to $5 billion in revenue a year, with about $1 billion plus or minus coming out of that in terms of profit.
So you cannot draw a direct correlation between California's high-speed rail and Northeast Corridor? I mean, they're just two completely different.
Well, not here. I mean, excuse me. I don't know if your question's done. We can't. I can't draw that conclusion here because you don't have the right data sets. We may have some folks that have an analysis, and I can look at that and get you an answer back.
Perfect. Thank you. Mr. Hanna.
Thank you, Chairman. Hi, Mr. McDonald. How are you, Commissioner?
Good.
Nice to have you here. The Advisory Commission, you're in the process of developing several other reports analyzing the pressure that would be taken off, projected pressure off of airlines, off of roads, and what that means to the Northeast Corridor. Will that report be done, and what will we be able to get out of it to tell us about the savings that might be incurred just by virtue of the pressure taking off of those other 2 or 3 modes of transportation?
It's nice to see you, Congressman.
Thank you.
We're undertaking right now several different initiatives. Number one, what you will get in early January is segment by segment up the corridor what the various infrastructure investment requirements are. And it's important to note that while it is done in a segment by segment basis, the Commission views the corridor as geographically silent. We don't look at the borders between states. We really look at the investments that are needed for the corridor overall. So you'll get that in January. Number two, in coordination with the I-95 Corridor Coalition, we are doing a highway intercept study. Mm-hmm. And what we are doing there is looking at ways that, in cooperation and collaboration with the Northeast Future Study, what types of people who currently use automobile would then transfer to the train intercity passenger rail, and that is going to be completed sometime in the spring. So, and you will get various updates on that. And lastly, what our primary initiative that we're undertaking right now is the cost allocation methodology, which is part of the PREA legislation that Congress enacted, which created the Commission to see what types of cost-sharing allocations need to be done between the states, Amtrak, and the federal government.
Will you be projecting the cost savings of any anticipated improvements in those facilities in the absence of the Northeast Corridor build-out?
You know, I think what we've all been doing as standalone states and as part of the corridor is looking at what those cost savings are. For example, in New York, we just instituted a major way of doing business on the service between Poughkeepsie and Schenectady, New York, and it was a wonderful collaboration with Amtrak, CSX, and the state as to how those costs are allocated, and those are the things that we will continue to be doing.
Mm-hmm. So that won't necessarily be broken out in terms of potential federal savings or federal offsets.
You know, I think the challenge that we're facing is first and foremost we're talking $150 billion here. And we see significant capital investments that need to be made. So one of the primary questions that needs to be answered is what are the funding sources to make those capital investments? And what we are evaluating is, you know, there will be public dollars, as we've been discussing here this morning. What is the capacity and the ability and the risk associated with private sector investment, and how does that all come to pass? And then as we do that, and we will look at where along with Amtrak and the Federal Railway Administration, where the potential savings are on the operating side, once you make those capital investments.
I understand. I'm just thinking of it in total. There could be a great many savings that this body might want to see and understand. It's going to be a hard sell.
You know, it is going to be a hard sell. In my 20 years working with both commuter railroads and in transportation, one of the reasons we're at the point we are right now, not to anybody's fault, but there hasn't been the type of investment made that needs to be made. We've all pointed to Superstorm Sandy, and fortunately, the tunnel connecting New Jersey and New York, even though it flooded, it did not breach. And that is huge. And a lot of times people talk about the tunnel and the Gateway project as a New York to New Jersey project. It is not. It's a corridor project. If that tunnel had collapsed, just think of what would have happened in the Northeast. Not the Northeast corridor, but in the Northeast. It would have paralyzed the region and the country. And we need those investments in additional tunnels in Baltimore, in New York, improvements on the bridges in Connecticut to make this system, to attract the ridership that we need to make that those cost savings and that calculation work.
I guess what I'm referring to also is the fact that the $4 billion in revenue that's projected, that's just one number, one benefit, one source. It's certainly far from what we should be talking about. And obviously, everybody knows that. But the more you can give us, the more you can parse this, the different angles you might take, I'm sure it's all going to be helpful.
And we will absolutely do that with Amtrak and our partners at USDOT.
Thank you. My time is up.
Any further questions from any members of the committee? Seeing none, I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for your testimony today. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that have been submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection so ordered, I'd like to thank our witnesses again for your testimony today and appreciate you working with our legislative calendar today. If no members have anything to add, the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you.